On a freezing November night in 1986, a woman disappeared without a trace. No body, no goodbye, no answers. But what detectives discovered at the frozen banks of a Connecticut river would lead to a murder conviction that rewrote American legal history and the method? So horrifying, so calculated, that even today, forensic experts use it to solve murders. This is the story of Helle Crafts and the man who turned murder into a twisted science experiment. Stay with us as we uncover the evidence that convicted a killer when there was nothing left but bone fragments and a terrible truth. Helle Nilsson Crafts seemed to have the perfect life. At 39 years old, she was a Pan Am flight attendant, a position that commanded respect and a comfortable salary in 1986. Elegant, poised, and multilingual, she'd escaped Denmark decades earlier to build a new life in America. She had 2 children and lived in an upscale home in Newtown, Connecticut, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and nothing bad was supposed to happen. But beneath the polished surface, Helle's world was cracking. Her husband, Richard Crafts, was a pilot and helicopter instructor. Charming, successful, and completely unfaithful. Helle had discovered his affairs through bank statements and credit card receipts. She'd confided in friends about his betrayals, his lies, his complete disregard for their marriage. By November 1986, Helle had made a decision. She was filing for divorce. What she didn't know was that Richard had already made his own decision, one far more permanent. On November 18, 1986, Helle returned home after a flight. It was a Tuesday. The children were there. Richard was there. Everything seemed normal. But as night fell that evening, something catastrophic happened behind closed doors. Something that would set into motion a chain of events so gruesome that forensic experts still study it today. By morning, Helle Crafts was gone. When Helle didn't show up to her next flight shift, alarm bells rang. This was unusual. Helle was professional and reliable. Her colleagues reached out to Richard. Where was she? Richard's story shifted like sand. First, he claimed she'd flown to Denmark to care for her ailing mother. Helle's friends didn't believe him. They called her mother themselves. She was fine. She hadn't heard from Helle in weeks. Next, Richard changed his story. Helle had gone on vacation with a friend, he said, another lie. Another explanation that unraveled within hours. But here's where it gets interesting. Richard's credit card statements told a very different story than his mouth did. In the days surrounding Helle's disappearance, Richard had made a series of purchases that seemed random until you pieced them together. He'd bought a new freezer, one that was never found in the house he'd purchased bed sheets and a comforter. And most damning of all, on November 19th, the very night of the snowstorm when Helle vanished, Richard had rented a woodchipper. Police didn't know why yet, but they were beginning to suspect something absolutely horrifying. Enter Keith Mayo, a private investigator working with Helle's concerned friends. Mayo was relentless. He interviewed everyone close to Richard, looking for cracks in his story. Then he spoke to someone who gave him chills, the nanny who lived in the Crafts' home. She described a scene from the morning after Helle's disappearance. Richard had suddenly ushered her and the children out of the house, claiming there was a power outage from the snowstorm. But while she was packing quickly, the nanny saw something that made her uneasy. On the master bedroom carpet, there was a large, mysterious red stain. When she asked Richard about it, he said it was kerosene. But kerosene wasn't red. The nanny also recalled something else. The carpet in that bedroom would later disappear entirely. Richard had it removed. Mayo brought this information to police, and suddenly, investigators had something concrete to investigate. They obtained a search warrant for the Crafts' home. What they found inside was the beginning of a forensic puzzle that would take months to solve. In the bedroom, investigators discovered blood splatters on the mattress. Laboratory tests revealed the blood type matched Helle's. On the windowsills, they found carpet fibers consistent with what had been removed. The physical evidence of violence was mounting. But still, no body. Then came the breakthrough. A snowplow operator named Joseph Hines came forward with a story that chilled investigators to their core. On the night of November 19th, during the blizzard, Hines had seen a man operating a woodchipper on a bridge over Lake Zoar. And that man had been deliberately pointing the machine toward the frozen water below. Police brought in forensic pioneer Dr. Henry Lee, the same expert who would later become famous for analyzing crime scenes around the world. Lee examined the evidence with meticulous precision. He coordinated with police to search Lake Zoar and the surrounding area. What they found would rewrite the future of American law. In the freezing waters and rocky shores of Lake Zoar, investigators recovered items that seemed impossible. Fragments so small that they might have been overlooked. But each one told a story. First, they found hair. Over 2,600 strands of bleached blonde hair, the same color as Helle's. But here's the thing, these hairs bore marks consistent with chainsaw cuts. Then came the fingernail, still painted with pink nail polish, the same shade Helle wore. A piece of tooth crown was found, and through dental records, it was matched with perfect certainty to Helle's own teeth, bone fragments, tissue, all recovered from the water's edge, all consistent with remains that had been run through a woodchipper. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the investigation of the chainsaw itself. Police recovered a chainsaw from the bottom of Lake Zoar. At first, the serial number had been deliberately scratched away, an obvious attempt to destroy evidence, but forensic technicians carefully restored the number. The chainsaw belonged to Richard Crafts. In a stunning experimental validation, authorities obtained a pig carcass and fed it through an identical woodchipper. The bone, fragmentation, the marks, the pattern of dispersal, all matched perfectly with Helle's remains. It was as if Richard had conducted a carefully planned experiment test, run the machinery, understand the mechanics, then execute his plan with precision. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was scientific proof of the unthinkable. By January 1987, Richard Crafts was arrested and charged with his wife's murder. But here's where the case became truly historic. Helle's body had never been recovered. Legally, this presented an unprecedented problem. Connecticut law required proof of death through the identification of a body. Without a body, prosecutors had an uphill battle. This had never been done before. The prosecution knew they had one option: prove death through the evidence of her remains. No matter how small, they brought in a forensic dentist who matched the tooth crown to Helle's dental records with absolute certainty. This expert analysis became the foundation for the Connecticut State Medical Examiner to issue an official death certificate on January 13, 1987. The first murder conviction without a body in Connecticut history. At trial, Richard maintained his innocence. He claimed he passed a lie detector test. He offered explanations for everything. But the weight of evidence was insurmountable. Over 2,600 strands of hair matching Helle's DNA. a chainsaw bearing his serial number, pulled from the lake with her hair on the blade's bone fragments consistent with his wife. A freezer purchase he couldn't explain. A woodchipper rental he couldn't explain. A carpet removal he couldn't explain. The jury deliberated, and after careful consideration of the most comprehensive forensic evidence ever assembled in a murder case, they reached a verdict guilty. Richard Crafts was sentenced to 50 years in prison. As the verdict was read, he showed no emotion. No tears, no reaction at all. Perhaps because he'd already run through every possible emotion during the months he'd been planning this crime. Helle Crafts never received a proper burial. Her remains were never found in their entirety. But the evidence of her husband's crime was so clear, so scientifically sound, that justice prevailed anyway. The case fundamentally changed Connecticut law. It established that a murder conviction didn't require a body, provided that forensic evidence could prove death with certainty. The precedent set by this case has been used in investigations across the country. Dr. Henry Lee went on to become one of America's most celebrated forensic investigators, and this case, the Woodchipper murder, became a cornerstone of his career. As for Richard Crafts, he served his time in prison, showing the same cold indifference he'd shown throughout the trial. No remorse, no acknowledgement of what he'd done. Some believe he simply calculated that murder was a logical solution to his divorce problem, that his wife's existence was merely an obstacle to remove. But Helle's legacy endured in courtrooms across America, in the thousands of investigations that followed, where forensic science, not the recovery of a body, became the evidence that convicted killers. Richard Crafts had tried to erase his wife from the world entirely, to turn her into nothing but fragments dispersed in a frozen lake. But instead, she became unforgettable. Her case became a landmark. Her death became justice, and the horror of that November night became the foundation for a new era of forensic investigation. Sometimes, the most meticulous crimes leave the most evidence, and sometimes, the absence of a body doesn't mean an absence of truth. The case of Helle Crafts remains one of the most studied murder investigations in American history, not because it was the most violent, not because it was the most famous, but because it proved that in the age of science, murder has no secrets left to keep. If you're fascinated by cases where forensic evidence becomes the witness, where science becomes the voice of the victim, subscribe to Verdict Unlocked.